So this book looks at where English has come from and how it's used today, and considers what it might look like in the future. Users of English get very anxious about the state of their language. Since the 15th century, in fact, people have feared that English is in decline. And in an effort to halt that downward spiral, people turn to the authorities that they hold dear to consider how to maintain and preserve these standards. But one of the questions I raise in this book is, where does the authority lie when it comes to determining the rights and wrongs of language use? And since we all understand that language does change over time, after all, Shakespeare's language is very different to ours, we might wonder, why are we so reluctant to let it change today? Now, going back to that question about where the authority lies in determining rights and wrongs, the obvious place, I suppose, to turn in such cases is a dictionary, the ultimate authority when it comes to pronouncements over meaning. But it's not always quite that simple. And to demonstrate this, I thought I'd take a recent, very public disagreement over the correct meaning of a particular English word. And this concerns the word fulsome, which you might remember it was used recently by Priti Patel, the former International Development Secretary, in her resignation letter to Theresa May, where she says at the bottom there, "I offer a fulsome apology to you and to the government for what has happened, and offer my resignation." The editor of the Times Literary Supplement, Stig Abel, responded to the news of this announcement by claiming that Priti Patel had got it wrong, and that what she should have said was a full apology. And he claimed fulsome means insincere. She's actually said the opposite of what she meant to say. Now, predictably, of course, this controversy was taken up by Radio 4, and there was a debate on the World at One over the correct meaning of the word fulsome. It's a nice example, I think, of the way in which, for users of English, the niceties of correct usage are often more newsworthy than the actual news itself. And so we had a debate between Stig Abel and reformed pedant and Times columnist Oliver Cam about the correct meaning of this word. But what is the answer, then, to this vexed debate over the correct meaning of fulsome? Who got it right? Where do we turn? Well, if we look in the Oxford English Dictionary, we might think of as the ultimate authority. I know I'm slightly biased, but it's one place people would turn. Then we can see that the earliest uses of the word fulsome, which date back to the 14th century, mean full, abundant, or plentiful. It's kind of what we'd expect from the word fulsome. It sort of sounds like it's going to mean that. So if we consider that the correct meaning of the word is the earliest one, then Priti Patel's fulsome apology is simply one that is very full. But if we were to take the view that the correct meaning of a word is the oldest meaning of the word, then that is problematic for a number of different reasons. So, for instance, the word silly originally meant innocent. Nice originally meant foolish. Tall originally meant handsome. If we went around trying to insist on the earliest historical meanings of these words, we'd be in all kinds of confusion. So what happened to the word fulsome subsequently? Well, if we look up the later developments of the word in the OED, we can see that by the 17th century, it had indeed developed some different usages. And so for OED sense 5 of language or behaviour, sense 5A is offensive or objectionable owing to excess or lack of moderation. Excessively effusive, complimentary, too lavish, overdone. So this is obviously the sense that Stig Abel was taking it in. It's perhaps this development, I suspect, is perhaps typical of the British uncomfortableness with sincerity. Anyone being complimentary is simply being gushy and overdoing it. By the early 20th century, however, the word fulsome began to be used in a positive sense once again, perhaps owing to the ambiguity in expressions like fulsome praise, in which it's difficult to understand or determine whether it's supposed to be negative, positive, or neutral. And so OED sense 5B is unrestrained, exuberant, effusive, lavish, wholehearted. So the Oxford English Dictionary allows us to trace this historical overview of the word and chart the changing meanings of it over time. but it doesn't actually tell us what's the correct meaning today. And in fact, what we can see from the evidence is that both senses 5A and 5B are still current today. So it seems, in fact, that there's real potential for ambiguity here, a word that can be used to mean, so when we talk about fulsome praise, for instance, we might mean it to mean abundant and heartfelt, or perhaps overdone and insincere. That might seem unhelpfully confusing, calling out for some authority figure to come and legislate as to which the correct meaning of the word is. You know, the OED, perhaps, should tell us, use it this way, not that way. But in fact, that's not really the way language works. It's in the hands of the users rather than of the lexicographers. And after all, many words have a variety of different meanings, perhaps not quite as extreme as these contradictory uses of the word fulsome, but a parallel case perhaps might be the recent developments in the use of the word literally, which of course etymologically, if you're one of those literally pedants, comes from Latin litera, letter, so it means to the letter or precisely or exactly, but now of course is widely used to mean precisely the opposite, metaphorically speaking. And for some people, of course, that's a travesty of the correct meaning, leading to all kinds of potential for confusion. But is it really confusing? How many times when you hear somebody say, "I'm literally dying for a coffee," do you actually phone an ambulance? We can work it out from the context. And of course, the phrases fulsome apology and fulsome praise are potentially ambiguous, as we've seen, but we don't usually have to interpret them in a vacuum. Understanding of the word, as with all words, is guided by context. And in the case we've been looking at, it's a resignation letter in which she expresses clear regret for her actions. It's, of course, possible that the use of fulsome here was some kind of covert attempt to distance herself from the apology. It seems unlikely. What's clear, I think, is that Ms. Patel didn't use the word incorrectly. Rather, Stig Abel chose to deliberately misread a potentially ambiguous usage. And interestingly, in the Radio 4 discussion on the World at One, Stig Abel began by immediately conceding that he realised now that the sense of full was perfectly acceptable. Made me wonder why he didn't look it up in the dictionary before he fired off the tweet. But nevertheless, at least by this stage, he'd realised he was wrong. He didn't, though, however, offer Ms. Patel an apology, fulsome or otherwise. He simply went on to accuse her of what is, for English speakers, I suspect, an even worse sin, that of using a longer word to sound more clever. So now she's being accused of saying fulsome because it sounds better and more intelligent than full. This is what H.W. Fowler, in his classic usage guide, Modern English Usage of 1926, memorably encapsulated in the maxim, "the love of the long word." Came up with this maxim, the better the writer, the shorter his words. And this is an example of many of these very nice, sort of easily quotable and memorable ideas, which of course are useful in some cases, but not in all cases. And it's certainly not the case that all long words are an attempt to deliberately obfuscate or show off. Sometimes they're just the right word. And Stig Abel, of course, didn't explain how he knew that this was an attempt to sound intelligent, and instead the discussion descended rather predictably and depressingly into a discussion of rather predictable, well-worn favourites such as the correct meaning of decimate, disinterested, and so on. What this example shows, I think, is that questions of correct usage are not always as easily resolved as we might hope. Language is more complicated than that. Turning to a dictionary can shed light on the ways in which a word like fulsome is used, but it doesn't necessarily provide us with clear right and wrong judgments. And the reason for that is that that's not what lexicographers are doing when they compile dictionaries. They're simply recording how words are used based upon analysis of large quantities of actual data, actual usage. So dictionaries then are descriptive rather than prescriptive. They describe the language use rather than telling us how to use it. The authority of traditional dictionaries is under threat today from online resources like Urban Dictionary. I don't know how many people would instead, in an example like this, instead of the OED, choose Urban Dictionary. But of course, in such cases, the authority is being taken away from the professional lexicographer and placed in the hands of the user. So the users are given the power to choose the words, to define them, and add quotations. Unlike a traditional dictionary, which sets out to report the facts of usage in an impartial, neutral way, online dictionaries, the partiality and bias of the user is openly displayed, often leading to rather contested and contradictory entries. So as an example of that, I've got two definitions that are provided in Urban Dictionary for man flu. See if you can work out where the bias lies here. It's not terribly complicated. The condition shared by all males wherein a common illness, usually a mild cold, is presented by the patient as life-threatening. Man flu is more painful than childbirth. This is an irrefutable scientific fact. Now, it's fairly obvious where the bias lies here, but in other cases, it can be more complicated. The opportunity to redefine words can have potentially dangerous consequences, especially in an era of post-truth and fake news. For instance, when Ivanka Trump last year was recently accused of being complicit in her father's agenda, she defended herself by saying, if being complicit is wanting to be a force for good and to make a positive impact, then I'm complicit. Now that might seem reasonable enough, but is that what complicit actually means? People turned to online dictionaries to find out. So for instance, dictionary.com recorded an 11,000% spike in searches for the word complicit following that interview. And it led them to make it their word of the year for 2017. And of course, in the dictionary, how it's defined is involved with others in an activity that is unlawful or morally wrong. There's a subtle distinction there. So I've been suggesting that lexicographers don't see themselves as arbiters of linguistic correctness, but authors of usage guides very frequently do. So I'm thinking of works like Simon Heffer's Strictly English or Neville Gwyn's Grammar, which set out to willfully misrepresent the complexities of actual usage in order to reduce them to simple rights and wrongs. So unlike lexicographers, authors of usage guides issue strongly worded prescriptions that are based on little more than personal preference. As an example, I've got here Simon Heffer's Strictly English definition of the word fulsome. So he says, we've all read the phrase about someone making a fulsome apology. Those who write it usually believe that the adjective means full or plentiful. It has not meant that since the early 16th century, and after 500 years of obsoleteness, we may legitimately consider that use redundant. Now, as we've just seen, of course, that's completely not the case. In fact, since the early 20th century, that use has been widely in use. So this is a complete misrepresentation, but it makes for a very straightforward kind of distinction. It's wrong to use it in that way. And so it seems to me unsurprising that users of English in search of guidance and certainty turn to works like these. The authoritative tone, the clear-cut judgment makes reassuring reading. I suspect Stig Abel, editor of the TLS, has a copy on his desk that he reached for when Priti Patel signed off that tweet. But the problem is that it's totally misrepresenting these evidence, giving the readers a misplaced confidence in its claims. What's perhaps even more baffling about books like these is that not even the authors pay attention to many of the rules that they themselves lay down. I've got a few examples of this from Simon Heffer's Strictly English. So for instance, here's what he says about the word mutual. Mutual does not mean shared, it means reciprocated. Dickens would have better called his book Our Common Friend. But then when he comes to write his own work, The Victorians, he says he saw Ralph Waldo Emerson during the Americans' visit to England in the winter of 1848, and they spoke much of their mutual friend Carlyle. The next example concerns the word involvement, where he says the noun involvement is used with equal lack of precision. There's no need to write that Smith's involvement in the crime was disputed when one should say that his part was disputed. And here he is in the Victorians again, When the South London Working Men's College was established in 1868, Huxley accepted the role of honorary principal, in which he served until 1880, and where his involvement was far from just ornamental. I've got one more example. I have tried to restrain myself here. You can see I quite enjoy doing this. I could have given you loads more. The next one is on enormity. And here he says, an enormity is something bad, a transgression, not something big. One should speak not of the enormity of the task, but of its enormousness, even if one is President of the United States. That might seem like a slightly bizarre thing to say, but this is a reference to the way that Barack Obama came under fire from the usage police after his presidential acceptance speech in 2008, where he said he was humbled by the enormity of the task ahead. And of course, all the headline writers said, he's got it wrong. He should have said enormousness. So even he can get it wrong. But of course, so can Simon Heffer, Moral Desperado. It's his biography of Thomas Carlyle, where he says, Carlyle was about to embark on his first large-scale literary project, A Life of Schiller, and was overwhelmed by the enormity of the task. Now, if even authors of usage guides don't follow the rules that they themselves are advocating, we might wonder why they're so concerned that everyone else should, and why does anybody bother paying any attention to them? I suspect that part of the answer lies in society's tacit acceptance that there are rights and wrongs in all aspects of language use, and a desire to be saved from embarrassment. So rather than question the grounds for the prescription, we turn to the usage pundits, just as we once turned to our school teachers in search of guidance and certitude. And many of us, of course, have fixed ideas about proper language use, and we use those often to identify people that we deem to be, in Evelyn Waugh's helpful formulation, NLOs, people who are not like one. Even though the rules that we're often using are ones that don't necessarily show any relationship to actual usage. They've been passed down to us, we've taken them on. Although I suspect few of us go quite as far as Brian Henderson, who gets so incensed by people using comprised of that he's corrected this supposed misuse on Wikipedia more than 47,000 times. Although many people would no doubt consider the thousands of hours that he admits to having spent on this crusade to be something of a waste of time, he would no doubt win the approval of Bill Bryson, who in his Dictionary of Troublesome Words says of comprised of, if you remember nothing else from this book, remember at least that comprised of is always wrong. Part of the attraction then, I think, of statements like these is that they're black and white. A usage is either right or wrong, and even better, like Brian Henderson, once we know it, we can go around correcting everyone else who doesn't know it. Now, probably the classic feature of English usage that's really liable to raise the blood pressure of those concerned with correctness is the apostrophe. Yeah, I'm sensing already, you can hear a sort of grumble in the audience that already tells me I'm on dodgy territory here. The former chief editor of the Oxford English Dictionary, John Simpson, in his recent memoir, The Word Detective, says of the apostrophe, the English are temperamentally obsessed with the presence or absence of apostrophes. It remains for many people a divide between civilization and chaos. And indeed, in 2014, when Cambridge Council voted to abandon apostrophes in street signs, it prompted a rogue grammar guerrilla to prowl the streets at night, armed only with a black marker pen. You probably can't even tell it's done so beautifully, but these are sort of black marker penned in apostrophes in Scholars' Walk and Pepys's Court. And this led to Cambridge Council rapidly reversing the decision, giving in to public pressure and restoring the precious apostrophe to the street signs of Cambridge. Although it's never really explained why, if it's Scholars' Walk and Pepys's Place, it's not Fitzgerald's Place. There's not complete consistency there. And of course, let's not even go into whether it should be Pepys apostrophe or Pepys apostrophe S. And in April 2017, the media reported on the Banksy of punctuation. It's this guy, a self-styled grammar vigilante, who patrols the streets of Bristol by night, armed only with what he calls his apostrophizer, which is basically that long stick with an apostrophe on the end of it. And he goes around climbing up ladders in pitch dark and putting in missing apostrophes into street signs and shop signs. Now, for many people, this punctuation crusader is a hero, bravely upholding standards in a society that ceased to care. But for others, he represents the unsavoury side of linguistic pedantry, revelling in social snobbery and one-upmanship. The apostrophe has long been a polarising issue amongst otherwise rational people. George Bernard Shaw, for instance, who was a vocal critic of English spelling and left a fortune in his will for somebody to devise a whole new alphabet to replace the Roman alphabet with which English is written, he insisted on dropping all apostrophes and so wrote can't and he's without apostrophes, like that, because he said there is not the faintest reason for persisting in the ugly and silly trick of peppering pages with these uncouth bacilli. Lewis Carroll, on the other hand, was a big fan of apostrophes and insisted that the only correct spelling of shan't and can't was, as you see here, with additional apostrophes to indicate the proper contractions. Now, of course, many today will happily omit apostrophes in emails and tweets, but others still insist on including it. So, for instance, the self-appointed monitor of Twitter posts, your, simply retweets messages where the two homophones have been confused and then adds wrong at the beginning of them. When it comes to the serious business of apostrophes, even the laid-back lexicographers of the Oxford English Dictionary can lose their cool. So, for instance, in going back to John Simpson's Word Detective, he describes that when the Oxford English Dictionary moved its offices in Oxford to a grand Georgian building on St Giles, considerable effort was invested in researching whether the headed notepaper should read St Giles apostrophe or with no apostrophe. For all the time spent consulting local records, newspapers, etymologists, in order to determine the correct form was indeed St Giles with an apostrophe. That's to show you that the St Giles Cafe knew it all along and could have told them for nothing. The lexicographers' judgments, though, have had little effect on other businesses on the streets and road signs, so St Giles without one. Missing apostrophes like these are met with dismay and anger by those concerned about linguistic standards, who fear that such changes are undermining our ability to communicate. But is the apostrophe really so crucial to the well-being of our society, and would consigning it to the dustbin really threaten the future of our language as a means of communication? It's seldom recognised that the apostrophe is, of course, just a feature of the written language with no spoken language correspondence. So I'm talking to you now using lots of contractions, not apostrophes, and somehow you're still understanding me. If we can do without it in speech, we might wonder whether we could do without it in writing. And in fact, the apostrophe in the history of English is a relatively recent innovation. It was first introduced into English printed books in the 16th century to indicate an elision or a contraction, as it does, of course, still today in she'll and can't and it's for it is. And then it was extended in the 17th century to indicate possession in singular nouns, like here, the boy's apostrophe S book, where the understanding was that here something had been contracted or omitted. In this case, they thought it was the third person possessive pronoun his. The boy, his book, had been abbreviated to the boy's book. In fact, that's completely wrong. The S ending here is simply an inflectional ending, a genitive ending. It goes back to an earlier form of English where it was much more heavily used, inflectional endings. But it sort of made sense to them because it was a contraction to extend it in this way. And then, subsequently, in the 18th century, further confusion was introduced when the apostrophe was used for plural possessives, putting it after the S, where, of course, nothing's been omitted at all. And so, as a consequence, the apostrophe has taken on two slightly different and contradictory roles to signal both elision and now also possession. And, of course, it's that contradiction that causes much of today's confusion, most notoriously, of course, in the distinction between its and its, it apostrophe s and its. Now, for Lynn Truss, the author of Eats, Shoots and Leaves, the Zero Tolerance Guide to English Punctuation, the rules of its and its are extremely simple, and so the punishment for breaking it should be suitably brutal. And she says getting your itses mixed up is the greatest solecism in the world of punctuation. No matter that you have PhD and read all of Henry James twice, if you persist in writing good food at its best, you deserve to be struck by lightning, hacked up on the spot and buried in an unmarked grave. But since the apostrophe can signal possession, it is reasonable to assume that the neuter possessive pronoun its should also have an apostrophe. And in fact, there's some historical precedent here too, because the its pronoun was first introduced in English in the 17th century to replace the earlier pronoun his, which rather unhelpfully overlapped with the masculine possessive pronoun, also his. And because it was formed by taking the subject pronoun it and adding the s genitive singular ending, the new pronoun was indeed initially written it apostrophe s for the possessive, just as it is here in the first folio of Shakespeare in the Tempest. Insecurity about where to place the apostrophe increasingly leads to its omission. So we frequently find examples where it's been left out, and then of course also contexts in which it's been added in unnecessarily. And the most common of these, of course, is what's known as the greengrocer's apostrophe, where it's added before a plural s. So called the greengrocer's apostrophe because it's apparently most commonly used by greengrocers advertising apples and oranges and so on with apostrophe s. There's some historical justification for this, however, also. So, for instance, here you can see when foreign words were borrowed into English in the 18th century ending in vowels, it was very common to write apostrophe s for the plural, as you can see in that example there, Handel's operas. So these have some historical justification, aren't necessarily just straightforwardly errors. And of course, we still use that apostrophe s when we're writing plurals of things like p's and q's and do's and don'ts. But despite this, Lynn Truss's zero tolerance message struck a chord with a huge audience. This is a massive bestseller, Eats, Shoots and Leaves. An audience who saw her as the champion of good English. The success of Eats, Shoots and Leaves helps to highlight a more cynical reason for the constant stream of books peddling extreme prescriptivism, and that is that it sells. The huge demand for books of this kind can be traced back to the beginnings of the prescriptive tradition in the 18th century. So up until that point, there was just a trickle of handbooks about English grammar, spelling, and punctuation. But after the 18th century, that was hugely increased. And in the 19th century, there was a publication of many of these kinds of prescriptive usage guides and grammars, including ones with alluring titles like these. Poor letter H, its use and abuse addressed to its little vowels. This is all about H dropping, if you're aware of that concept, you know, where you say ow instead of how, and instead of hand. Again, a hugely sort of divisive feature of English pronunciation, which we can trace back to the 18th century, where dropping your H's is seen as being slovenly. You don't care very much. You can't be bothered. You're lazy. You know, it's very closely related in the 19th century, the idea of poor English and poor sort of social skills being vulgar and so on. And this one, don't, a manual of mistakes and improprieties more or less prevalent in conduct and speech, there's a close association here between good English and good breeding, and the assumption that making mistakes shows that you're vulgar and slovenly. To give you a sort of flavour of don't, I've included a few examples here. You quite quickly pick up the style of the book. It makes rather sort of slow reading. Don't speak ungrammatically. Study books of grammar and the writings of the best authors. Don't pronounce incorrectly. Listen to the conversation of cultivated people. And if in doubt, consult the dictionaries. Don't notice in others a slip in grammar or a mispronunciation in a way to cause blush or to offend. If you refer to anything of the kind, do it courteously and not in the hearing of other persons. That's one that I think we probably still could learn a bit from. Where electronic usage today is often seen as a forum in which standards of grammar, spelling and punctuation are relaxed, and where non-standard usage is tolerated or even encouraged, sites like Twitter, Facebook and Instagram are also used as a means for sticklers to find a wider audience for the linguistic blunders they find around them. So for instance, Twitter accounts like this one, Grammar Nazi. How many of you follow Grammar Nazi? Incidentally, Grammar Nazi must be one of the few areas left in society where it's socially acceptable to self-identify as a Nazi. Many people use that in their Twitter bios. But these kinds of sites, of course, seldom take account of the fact that the perpetrators of the errors that they are shaming are often non-native speakers of English or people with access to fewer educational standards and opportunities than themselves. Donald Trump's notorious misspellings, as are sort of heralded here. So these are examples like, my next slide has a few of these, you've probably seen many more. Paid, tap, honoured, dumber, unprecedented, that's quite a nice one, by sort of Freudian. Now these of course might seem like fair game, but here we run the risk, I think, of falling into the same trap as the Radio 4 discussion over the correct meaning of fulsome. Does it matter that the most powerful man in the world can't spell or can't be bothered to use a dictionary? Well, maybe, but surely not as much as his attitude to the Middle East or North Korea or global warming or human rights and so on. Our love of correcting others is epitomised in the success of T-shirts like this one, I'm silently correcting your grammar. Now, of course, since many people, speakers of English, use regional dialects, this is often simply a way of engaging in regional and social snobbery. While the term dialect is popularly employed to refer to a non-standard or even substandard form of the language, for linguists the term is actually neutral. So standard English is simply just one of the dialects of English, albeit one that's been accorded greater social status, whereas we tend to think very often as standard English being above all the other dialects of English. It's that recognition that all dialects are linguistically important that prompted an American linguist to produce a rival T-shirt. Now this says, not judging your grammar, just analysing it. But this has provoked unease, even amongst its supporters. So one US tweeter found herself in support of the sentiment, but unable to wear the T-shirt because it uses the British English spelling of analysing. That's with the S, S rather than a Z. You see how difficult it is. Comments like these, I think, remind us that however tolerant we might like to think we are about linguistic variation, we all have our own pet peeves and linguistic bugbears. So even professional linguists could be guilty of this. So Deborah Cameron, the author of an important study of linguistic prescriptivism called Verbal Hygiene, says that while she has learnt to overcome knee-jerk judgments that are inappropriate in her field, she still finds herself sensitive to particular solecisms. I can choose to suppress the irritation I feel when I see, for example, a sign that reads potatoes, there's the greengrocer's apostrophe again. I cannot choose not to feel it. See how sort of ingrained these ideas are. And you can see from the next slide, not everyone feels the same restraint. You know, are you that person that always has that marker pen on you, just in case? Part of the reason for our unwillingness to accept the changing meanings of words like fulsome and the demise of the apostrophe is that we've taken the trouble to learn the rules surrounding their use, and so have considerable investment in ensuring that other people are obliged to observe them. And that applies also to the complexities of English spelling. So we might tacitly acknowledge, with its silent letters and erratic relationship to pronunciation, that English spelling isn't a terribly efficient and effective way of conveying the English language, but because we have spent and invested so much time in learning it, we feel rather judgmental of those who make spelling mistakes. And here I'm going to give you a quick spelling test, okay? And it's, how do you spell the word supersede? I'll give you a moment to think about that. Supersede. S-U-P-E-R, and then I want to know whether you'd say S-E-D-E or C-E-D-E. So let's say hands up for the C. Okay. Most people? Hands up for the S.
Oh, no, I think
okay. It's actually S. Interesting, isn't it? Interesting. The reason for this is that it comes back to etymology, and the word supersede goes back to the Latin supersedeo, to sit on top of, literally. Superseding something sits on top of it. Whereas those of you who thought it was a C probably were thinking of words like recede, intercede, and precede, which actually have a different Latin etymology. They come from the verb cedere, to go. Now, the reason I use this example is because so many people get it wrong, in fact. If you got it wrong, you're in the majority in this room, but also in all the times I've asked this question. And what it makes me wonder is, does that mean that many people don't know how to spell and need to go back to school and learn? Or does it mean that the spelling of the word supersede is actually changing? More people are spelling it with a C rather than an S. Now, you might also argue that it would be better if we did spell it that way because it fits more with recede, intercede, and precede. It's a more logical spelling of the language. Do we need to preserve those etymological distinctions, which after all don't really mean very much for modern users of English? I know from personal experience people are very hostile to the idea that spelling should be allowed to change over time. It's probably the area of the language where people feel most invested in the ideas of correctness. There's only one correct way to spell a word. But in fact, evidence that this word might be changing its meaning, in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, supersede with a C is a variant of supersede. It seems as if it's becoming more acceptable. For those of you who did get it right and think that's just wrong, you'll be glad to see that the Oxford Dictionary online says it's generally regarded as an error. Although notice, generally regarded as an error. Is that sort of opening the door to the possibility that that might change in time? Well, as I said, people are very hostile to this idea. I suggested this when I did a test of the audience at the Hay Festival a few years ago on this exact word, and then suggested that perhaps this word was changing its spelling. I found myself the next day front page news all over the world, bizarrely. Here's a particular headline I enjoyed in Oxford. Accused of single-handedly lowering literacy expectations amongst primary school children all over the country, and so on. We might wonder whether the increasing development of and adoption of emojis, though, which allow speakers to communicate without the need for language, means that we'll no longer need to learn to spell and cease to communicate in English at all. I put the winky face emoji there to tell you I'm just joking. Don't worry. But am I actually? Because there are, after all, 1 billion users of English in the world today, but that number is positively dwarfed by the number of people who own a smartphone and who use emojis. And in fact, emoji use has expanded to the extent now that it's common for entire messages to be conveyed using these symbols, enabling them to be understood by speakers of any language. So here's an example from Andy Murray's wedding day tweet, where he describes what happened to him on his wedding day using emojis. Now, it's relatively easy to decode this message given that a typical wedding day involves a number of conventional and formulaic activities, it's harder when the message is written entirely in emoji and completely decontextualized. And to give you an example of that, here are two opening sentences from famous novels written in emoji. Any ideas what the first one is? Best of times and the worst of times. Yeah, it loses a little bit in translation, doesn't it? But what about the second one? Pride and Prejudice. Yeah, exactly, that's right. It's a truth universally acknowledged that a man in possession of a good fortune must be in need of a wife. But where the use of emoji has grown out of a radical move to shake off the constraints of written language, users remain restricted by the numbers and types of emoji available. And release of new emoji, of course, subject to the approval of the Unicode Consortium, which is a kind of linguistic academy, I suppose. And decisions like these are typically rather contentious, given the lack of representation of certain ethnic groups, their cultures and religions. And it's only recently it's been possible to choose from a range of skin tones. And the official use is a kind of dictionary of etymology set out in the Emojipedia database. While recent updates have enabled greater cultural diversity, the representation of foods and clothes and places of worship still remain highly westernized. However representative emoji become, it's not possible to legislate for the cultural sensitivity of the user either. So for instance, the pine decoration emoji, which represents kadumatsu, placed at the front of Japanese homes at New Year to welcome the spirits in the hope of a plentiful harvest, is regularly used in the West as an offensive gesture. There's not much you can do about that. The creativity with which users repurpose emoji is further apparent from the surprising success of the aubergine or eggplant emoji amongst sexing teenagers, which prompted Instagram to ban it from their searching facility. And the success of the suggestive connotations of the aubergine emoji has even led to the establishment of eggplantmail.com, a company that allows you to send a personalized message on an aubergine anywhere in the world. But I don't think there's any danger of emoji replacing English as the global language. It would need a vastly increased number of characters, and most significantly, it lacks the grammatical rules that are necessary for the formation of more complex constructions. And that claim might seem to be undermined by the appearance recently of the entirety of Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick in emoji. Emoji Dick, as it's known. The entire novel has been translated for you into emoji. And you might think, well, in that case, if you can do Moby Dick, then surely we can do basic conversation. But it seems to me that a glance at the resulting translation highlights the limitations of the format. So, for instance, you can see here the famous opening sentence, "Call me Ishmael," represented by a telephone, a man with a moustache, a boat, a whale, and an OK sign. Doesn't quite do it for me, but... So in conclusion then, the future of the English language seems assured, but it's likely to be a future of multiple Englishes, as new technologies emerge and as new users continue to adopt it and adapt it to suit a wide range of functions across the English-speaking globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. We've got time for a few questions, so if you put your hand up and I'll try and get to you with the mic.
Hey, so we've got all the options with operating systems and on our phones and whatnot to add misspelled words to dictionary so that it won't constantly remind us that we're misspelling things. Do you get any data from any of that to see trends of what's changing in what you do?
And Oxford Dictionaries collects all of that, but they collect it from the perspective of what people type into the online dictionary searching capacity. So the number of times that people search for a word and misspell it. So for instance, they've got data on how many times people are entering supersede with the supposed incorrect spelling. So that kind of data I've seen, but not precisely what you were asking, but that's very interesting. And that's the sort of thing, you're right, that would be interesting to capture more of and see the total. Because of course a lot of what part of the reason why people think of spelling as being so fixed is that what we're mostly used to seeing and what dictionaries are used to seeing is published text, which has rather artificially gone through a whole process of auto-correcting, proofreading, copy editing, and so on, where people are spending a laborious amounts of time trying to ensure that the spelling is all correct. And where, of course, when people are actually writing by hand or typing things in without checking it, very often, of course, we get things wrong.
How many of these challenges are unique to English and how many apply to all languages?
Interesting question. The idea that, all languages change. All languages that are spoken and used are changed. Of course, the ones that don't are sort of fixed, dead languages, like Latin, for instance. So all languages are changing that are being used. But, of course, English, what it has particularly is the way that English is growing today in terms of new speakers are people using it as a second language. And that's sort of, it's not unique to English because that's true of, say, Spanish too, but the large percentage of people that are acquiring it as a second language, and therefore it's being sort of learnt in different ways, and it is then coming into contact with a much wider range of different languages spoken by different people. That's causing whole kinds of new forms of English to emerge. So, for instance, English in South Asia, where it's a big growth area, we've got things like Singlish, where it's English, but it's spoken by people who also speak Mandarin, who also use a variety of different languages, Malay and so on. They're borrowing words from those other languages they speak. And so what we're seeing is new forms of English emerging. Is that a form of English, or is it a form of Singlish, or is it something else in between? Sometimes they're called interlanguages. And so I think that's sort of unique to English in the sense that it's such a global language.
How you touched a little bit on how you might correct somebody if you hear something wrong. If I was to say to you, can I lend that pen off you? What would you say and how would you handle it?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Again, that to me is a dialect usage. So it's quite common in some dialects of English to use the word lend to mean borrow. There are other languages where the same word is... Sorry?
I'm agreeing, yeah. In Wales, that's totally fine.
Okay. Yeah, so I would take the perspective that that's a dialect usage. And therefore, it's wrong in terms of if I take the standard English as the correct form of the language. But if you spoke it, you're speaking a dialect, and there's no compulsion on people to speak standard English. Often that is what people are saying, is that what you're saying is wrong because it's not standard. But actually, we're only really compelled to write standard English. If you wrote that, then that might be more problematic. So if a student put that in an essay to me, for instance, I would have to correct it on the grounds that I'm trying to make sure that they're writing in standard English. But if they said it to me, then I'd be inclined to just let it go because it's just their dialect form.
Thank you, I'll let my mother know.
Right.
Hi, I can perhaps ask from the Polish language. Sometimes the word is written in one way and it's supposed to be read in that way, but people start using a letter that actually doesn't exist, or a sound that actually doesn't exist. Why do people do this? I can give an example. We have the word włączać, which means to turn something on, and people say włączać, and such letter doesn't exist. How does it happen? And can we stop this?
I'm not sure whether that's something that's particular to Polish, but changes in pronunciation happen all the time. They're often driven by people assuming that what you're doing when you're pronouncing a word is you are following the spelling quite closely. And so the history of English quite often is the emergence of spelling pronunciations, partly because particularly in English, literacy is seen as such an important thing. So it's why H dropping, for instance, is so frowned upon, because if the word's spelt with an H, you have to pronounce the H. Of course, that's getting it wrong way round, because of course speech comes way before writing, and there's no reason why speech should be based upon writing. But in a literate society, that's often seen as that's the correct. So it might be that that's what's happening, is people are sort of going back to the spelling and then producing a new pronunciation because they're trying to closely represent what's there. No, I can't do anything about it, though. I should just add that.
I'll take two more questions quickly.
In the beginning of your book, you show how the language changed over, I think, the past 400, 500, 600 years. And some words are totally, you can't understand them, and you write in current English how it is.
Yeah.
Now, how long time do you, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you think, how many 100 years will it take for people in the future, looking back how we speak today, that will be totally understandable, like in the beginning of your book?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because it's certainly true that if you go back to Old English, the earliest recorded form of English, which is going back to sort of 7th century is some of the earliest written records, but anything between then and about the year 1000, the language that and how it looked at that point, you cannot be understood by a modern English speaker without the aid of special study and a dictionary. So the language has changed that radically. But in fact, if you go to the period from, say, about 1500, so if you've ever read the works of Chaucer, for instance, that's much closer to modern English. And probably with looking up a few words, you can make some sense of it. So I think that there was a particularly radical change that happened around about the year 1000 to English, which has meant that it's now completely unrecognisable to us. And part of the reason for that is to do with the Norman conquest, the influx of French speakers and so on. So the language has changed less, it's sort of slowed down. So I don't think it's going to be quite as radical in the future. But the other factor is, of course, standardization, which is an artificial process that stops the language changing. It's a break, as it were. Naturally, English would change much more in speech, but of course, we often say to children when they're learning the language, no, it's not foots, it's feet. We've artificially constrained that. You naturally produce that form, foots, but we tell them it's incorrect. And that's slowed it down and made it, the changes much less radical. So that partly is an answer to say I don't think it will change as radically as if we look back 1,000 years. The other thing is, though, that technology is what's driving language change today. And you know better than I do what the future is for technology. In the 15th century, the printing press was introduced, which slowed everything down and made standardization possible. Now you could say that that sort of technology is driving a de-standardization, promoting variation, so that in fact that could sort of mean that standard English will start to be threatened and language will change much more obviously.
Your talk was so interesting, thank you. I'm just wondering, okay, clearly you're telling us to be a little bit more relaxed, or me to be more relaxed than I have been about
it wasn't you personally, but
apostrophes,
if you felt it was for you.
Spelling and things like that. But at what point do you think we do need to be worried about sort of descending into a kind of 1984 double-speak world where we no longer, we lose the concept of what is true because language becomes so completely kind of falsified? It's the Ivanka Trump, complicit means blah, blah, blah. At what point do your sort of alarm bells go off, and do you think, actually, we do need to object to this because we are at risk of sliding into 1984?
I think in terms of the idea that, it's often said, oh, that's all fine, but what about when we cease to be able to communicate with each other, when things have gone down to that stage? But of course, language is primarily a system of communication, so it has its own methods of controlling that and stopping that happening. So when confusion genuinely sets in, then there are ways in which language will self-regulate. So I don't think it needs that kind of external regulation to stop it, because the speakers themselves tend to work that out. So where there is like two words that really conflict with each other, what happens is that one usually falls out of use or becomes very specialized. So in that sense, I don't think we need to interfere with it. But having said that, there's also the fact that, for instance, with me, when my students turn in essays, I'm still obliged to tell them, this is right, this is wrong. And, it certainly would be a dereliction of duty to say, oh, don't worry about it. Don't get so hung up on apostrophes, guys. Because, ultimately they're going out into the world of work where they will be judged on that. That is right or wrong. People do judge you. It's, on your language use. That's just the way of the world. So in that sense, that, those two things are in conflict, I would say. And as long as there are, dictionaries producing sort of authoritative statements about correct usage, I think that helps in a sense. But I mean, that bigger question about redefining words, and that's a very live one, I think.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was both fascinating and great fun.
Thank you. Thanks.